Sometimes, love doesn't die in silence. It shatters with the sound of a door closing, a storm rising, and footsteps that never return. A pregnant wife was left in a snowstorm, and the millionaire would come to regret it. When she returned, they say love conquers all. But for one woman, love turned into a betrayal so deep it nearly cost her and her unborn child their lives. This is the story of Natalie Whitmore, a woman whose devotion to her wealthy husband, Jackson Pierce, led her into the heart of a snowstorm, only to be abandoned when she needed him most. But destiny had other plans for Natalie. Against all odds, she survived, emerging stronger than ever. And when she returned, the truth she carried would shake Jackson's world to its very foundation, leaving him to face a reckoning he never saw coming. Jackson Pierce was a self-made millionaire, renowned for his sharp intellect and relentless ambition. Born and raised in a working-class suburb outside Pittsburgh, Jackson had clawed his way to the top of the real estate development world. For years, the mere mention of his name opened doors and caused seasoned investors to sit up straighter. He owned a penthouse overlooking the Ohio River, spent weekends at an exclusive club in Aspen, and among his prized possessions was a vintage Chevy Camaro, acquired during a charity auction at the Frick Car and Carriage Museum. He rarely let emotion cloud his judgment, priding himself on making decisions grounded in logic and results. Natalie Whitmore met Jackson when she was just 23. She had taken a position as a junior paralegal at a mid-sized law firm that specialized in corporate mergers and acquisitions. Jackson had walked in one day, commanding attention with his magnetic presence. He wasn't just attractive, he radiated confidence, a man used to winning. At the time, Natalie was new to the corporate world. She had dreams of attending law school one day, but for now, she needed stability to support her aging father. Jackson quickly noticed Natalie's diligence, her knack for catching overlooked details in contracts. Late-night phone calls turned into dinners to discuss business, and soon, business turned personal. Within a year, Jackson proposed at a luxurious restaurant in downtown Denver, slipping a diamond ring onto Natalie's finger to the applause of curious onlookers. They married in an opulent ceremony that made headlines in society pages. Her modest upbringing faded into the background, overshadowed by his growing fortune. But beneath Jackson's charm and success lay a steely heart, one that measured every interaction by its value. Natalie became less of a partner and more of an accessory, someone to accompany him to events, care for the home, and silently conform to his will. She believed they were building a future together. But behind the scenes, Jackson was making decisions that slowly eroded her sense of self. At first, Natalie didn't notice the subtle control. How he insisted on managing their finances, his dismissive comments about her law school aspirations, and his casual disregard for her emotional needs. Over time, the cracks in their marriage widened. Though Natalie tried to keep life moving, volunteering at a local community center and checking in on her father, Jackson's empire continued expanding, pulling him further away from home. Each new business deal pulled Jackson further from home, and with each victory, he became colder, more calculating. Meanwhile, Natalie felt invisible, loved only when it was convenient, heard only when she offered praise. The pregnancy was unexpected, a flicker of hope in Natalie's otherwise lonely life. She was overjoyed when she saw the positive test result, imagining that maybe this baby could be the bridge to reconnect her and Jackson. She had no idea it would become the very thing to drive them further apart. Natalie spent days trying to find the right moment to tell Jackson about the pregnancy. On a frigid winter evening, she finally gathered the courage. She prepared a quiet dinner in their upscale condo, determined to share the news gently, but joyfully. But Jackson stormed in late, shrugging off his coat with a scowl. Natalie could see the tension in his brow as he stared down at his phone, engrossed in texts from business partners. "Jackson, can we talk for a moment?" she asked, forcing a smile, even as fear churned in her stomach. He barely looked up. "Whatever it is, can we do it later? I've got a contract negotiation with the Langford Group in the morning, and everything's going haywire." "It's really important," Natalie insisted, trying to steady her voice. With a sigh, Jackson placed his phone on the marble countertop. "All right, what is it?" When she told him about the pregnancy, Jackson was silent for several agonizing seconds. Natalie watched as his jaw tightened. She expected him to wrap his arms around her, to share in the miracle of bringing new life into the world. Instead, his eyes cooled, and he exhaled slowly. "You couldn't wait?" he asked flatly. A lump rose in Natalie's throat. "Wait for what?" she managed. "For a better time," Jackson snapped, turning away to retrieve his phone. "We're in the middle of the biggest property acquisition our firm has ever handled. Do you have any idea how much pressure I'm under?" Natalie blinked back tears. She wanted to tell him that a pregnancy wasn't something you could time around business deals, but part of her still hoped he'd come around once the shock wore off. Jackson gave her a quick once-over, his eyes pausing briefly on her abdomen. "We'll figure something out," he said at last, then disappeared into his office. That night, Natalie slept in the guest bedroom for the first time. She told herself it was temporary, that Jackson was just overwhelmed. But deep down, a heavy dread settled in. She couldn't deny it any longer. She had married a man who saw even their child as negotiable if it disrupted the life he had carefully crafted. Weeks passed, each day bringing more strain between Natalie and Jackson. She tried to explain that she needed emotional support. She was dealing with morning sickness, intense fatigue, and growing anxiety about becoming a mother. But Jackson remained distant, scolding her for complaining too much, and suggesting she focus on staying out of his way during the busiest season of his career. One frigid January evening, after an especially bitter argument, Natalie packed a small duffel bag and booked a room at a modest hotel near downtown Cincinnati. She needed space, time to think, and some semblance of peace. Yet deep inside, she longed for Jackson to come after her, to call her in the middle of the night, to finally realize the gravity of what he had done and beg her to return home. No call ever came. Still, Natalie refused to give up. She reached out to a friend who worked at a small local law office, hoping to find a part-time job that would allow her to earn some of her own income. In the meantime, she carefully scheduled prenatal checkups at a women's clinic affiliated with St. Anthony's Hospital, using her personal savings to avoid alerting Jackson. Maybe, she thought, once the baby arrived, Jackson would finally understand what it meant to be a father. But then, on a gray mid-February day, fate took a cruel turn. Natalie had returned to the condo to collect a few of her belongings. Despite the tension, she still stayed there occasionally. Her name still on the lease. Her presence more like a ghost than a partner. As if summoned by some cruel twist of fate, Jackson arrived, fresh from a disastrous meeting. He was tense, his jaw set like stone. They clashed in the hallway, voices echoing in the cold, quiet space. He blamed her for distracting him from crucial business decisions. He insisted the pregnancy had come at the worst possible time. "Worst possible time," Natalie repeated, her stomach churning. "This is your child we're talking about." Jackson let out a short, bitter laugh. "Children need stable foundations. And you've been nothing but unpredictable. You left for a hotel, you challenged my decisions. How am I supposed to trust you with this family's future if you can't even keep yourself together?" Natalie's fury boiled over. "I've been trying to keep it together since the day I married you," she shouted. "You control everything. You tear me down. Where's the love, Jackson?" It was a confrontation months in the making. Neither would back down. And then, as Natalie grabbed her coat to leave, something inside Jackson snapped. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he roared, slamming his palm against the wall. "You want to go? Then go. I don't care that you're pregnant. Just do it, but don't expect me to chase after you." Natalie's eyes brimmed with tears. She bit her lip, too shattered to speak, too wounded to reason with him. She yanked open the door to the howling storm outside, determined not to spend another minute in a home that felt more like a prison. The wind slashed across her face the moment she stepped outside. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, rapidly blanketing the sidewalk. She had nowhere else to go, only her battered old car in the driveway, the same one she'd driven when she worked as a paralegal. Jackson didn't offer to drive her anywhere. He simply shut the door behind her. Natalie fumbled with the car keys, her hands trembling, more from rage than cold at first. She slid into the seat, slammed the door, and tried to start the engine. Finally, the engine sputtered to life. Natalie realized she was in no state to make clear decisions, but stubborn pride held firm. There was no way she was going back inside to ask Jackson for help. The streets were dangerously slick. Snowdrifts rose quickly, and visibility shrank to almost nothing. Natalie gripped the wheel, squinting into the blinding white. Her phone buzzed. It was likely her friend or maybe her father, but she was too rattled to answer safely. So she let it ring. Moments later, the car jerked forward, wheels spinning helplessly against the icy pavement. She tried to push through it, but the vehicle skidded, slamming into a street lamp and jerking to a halt. Natalie's heart pounded as pain shot through her abdomen. The seatbelt dug sharply into her belly. Breathing heavily, panic surged through her. She fumbled with the belt, wincing as she unlatched it. She tried to restart the car. Nothing. The engine was dead. Outside, the blizzard was only getting worse. Her phone's battery flashed red at 10%, the screen slightly cracked from jostling in her purse. She dialed 911, praying someone would pick up quickly, but the call dropped almost instantly due to poor signal. She tried again, and again. But the wind howled around the car, and every attempt ended in silence. Her temperature started dropping. She rummaged through the back seat and found only a thin scarf. Every breath felt like shards of ice stabbing her lungs. Desperate, she stepped out of the car and into the blizzard. The cold was savage. Her gloved hands numbed within seconds. She attempted to walk toward the condo or any familiar landmark, but the wind and snow made it nearly impossible. She took only a few steps before falling into a deep snowdrift. She tried to stand, but the wind knocked her down again. Then the reality struck her hard. She was pregnant, trapped in a blizzard, and completely alone. Numbness crept up her limbs, dizziness overtaking her senses. Before she could form a better plan, a wave of blackness washed over her, and she collapsed face first into the snow. Natalie lost all sense of time, drifting in and out of consciousness. At one point, she felt strong arms lifting her. A voice, aged and calm, whispered something soft and reassuring. Next, the scent of burning wood, a rush of warmth, and the crackle of fire filled her senses. When she finally opened her eyes, she was wrapped in thick blankets near a fireplace in a small, rustic cabin. Kneeling beside her was an older woman with streaks of silver in her hair, wearing a faded sweater and worn-out boots. She introduced herself as Marlene Godfrey, a retired nurse who had settled in this remote area seeking solitude after the devastating loss of her own daughter. Marlene spoke with quiet confidence as she instructed Natalie to stay still while she checked her for signs of frostbite or hypothermia. Natalie's lips trembled and tears of relief welled in her eyes, blurred her vision as she realized she was safe, at least for now. The baby, Marlene assured her, seemed fine according to the basic checks she was able to perform, but Natalie would need a proper hospital visit for a full examination. Outside, the storm raged for 2 more days, cutting off power and phone lines to the cabin. Marlene used a backup generator sparingly and rationed her limited food and supplies. Her kindness became the only source of comfort Natalie had during the darkest hours of her life. Natalie told Marlene the truth, that her husband had cast her out in anger and that she had nowhere else to go. Marlene listened, nodding occasionally, sometimes murmuring quietly with empathy. By the time the skies cleared enough for Marlene to drive her old pickup truck into the nearest town, Natalie had shared more of her story than she had ever told anyone. There was something about the older woman's calm, steady presence that encouraged complete honesty, as if releasing it all in that quiet cabin could somehow begin to mend her. When they reached town, Natalie's phone finally sprang to life. A flood of missed calls and messages filled the screen, some from her father, others from her friend, and a few from an unknown number. But nothing from Jackson. The hollow ache in her chest deepened. One frantic voicemail from her father begged her to call back, terrified after news broke of a massive pileup on the very highway she might have taken. After ensuring Natalie was examined at a local clinic, Marlene quietly paid the bill when she noticed Natalie fumbling for her wallet. Natalie protested, insisting she would repay her. But Marlene gently rested a hand on her arm. "I've lost enough in my life," she said, her voice slightly trembling. "You and that baby, you have a future. Let's make sure you keep it." Natalie's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in months, she felt something real, a connection, a reminder that compassion still had a place in the world. News of Natalie's near-fatal ordeal eventually made its way to Jackson, not because he looked for her, but because one of his employees heard rumors. At first, Jackson scoffed at the idea that she'd nearly died, calling it a melodramatic stunt for sympathy. But as the days passed and Natalie didn't return, a small prick of guilt began to fester in his conscience. He called her phone a few times. Each attempt was met with an automated message that the number was no longer in service. What he didn't know was that Natalie had changed her number, desperate to avoid his reach. She found temporary refuge at Marlene's cabin while she worked to rebuild. The older woman lived simply, but she had enough space for Natalie to stay as long as she needed. Days turned to weeks, and slowly, with each quiet act of kindness from Marlene, Natalie's heart began to soften. Marlene took her to the local community center, introduced her to friendly neighbors, and gave her small tasks in her vegetable garden to keep her occupied. Bit by bit, Natalie began to heal from both the emotional and physical wounds. She wrote in a journal, documenting her ordeal, and found therapy in the simple routines of daily life. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was finally in control of her own destiny. Meanwhile, Jackson's business was teetering on the edge of crisis. The highly publicized Langford Group deal, once a beacon of success, was now on the verge of collapse. A scandal involving one of Jackson's senior executives had come to light. Combined with a string of poorly managed investments, it threatened the very foundation of his real estate empire. Jackson now spent the majority of his time putting out fires, meeting with lawyers, and scrambling to salvage the situation. When asked publicly about his wife's disappearance, he brushed it off, vaguely attributing Natalie's absence to family matters, and never offering specifics. Behind closed doors, though, rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered that she had left him. Investors grew uneasy, citing an unsettled personal life as a potential sign of instability in business. Jackson seethed at the suggestion, but the murmurs refused to die down. In quiet moments, if he allowed himself to feel, Jackson would think of Natalie's gentle smile, the hope in her voice when she told him she was pregnant. He repeated to himself that he had done nothing wrong, that Natalie had simply been too weak to thrive in his high-pressure world. Still, the silence in his penthouse gnawed at him. At night, he wandered the halls, haunted by the absence of her soft footsteps, her occasional laughter. But pride kept him from reaching out. If she wanted to come back, she would. On her knees, as far as he was concerned. That's what he told himself anyway. Meanwhile, Natalie's belly swelled with each passing month, a growing reminder of the life she now protected with every breath. Thanks to Marlene's network, Natalie found a modest but steady job assisting a local attorney who specialized in family law. She handled paperwork and legal filings, her paralegal background finally being put to meaningful use. Her new boss, Helen Pierce, was a compassionate woman who sensed Natalie's guardedness about her past. Helen never pried, but always offered quiet, steady support. Every paycheck Natalie earned was carefully tucked away. She was planning for the future, something she hadn't truly done during her marriage. She slowly began building a sense of independence she never thought possible. Gone were the designer clothes and lavish parties. In their place was a quieter life, but one filled with real satisfaction. Natalie found comfort in peaceful routines. She'd spend long evenings alone, her hand resting gently on her growing stomach. She thought of baby names, read articles on prenatal care, and promised herself that her child would never feel neglected or unloved. Still, Natalie couldn't fully escape the shadows of her old life. Her marriage to Jackson was still legally intact, and the thought of a custody battle chilled her to the core. The idea of Jackson's cold, calculated hands ever touching her baby made her stomach turn. One late afternoon, after running a few errands in town, Natalie returned to Marlene's cottage to find an envelope waiting on the kitchen table. Inside was a letter from a Cincinnati-based private investigator who had apparently visited while she was out. The note read, "Miss Natalie Pierce, husband has requested information regarding your whereabouts. This letter serves as official notice that an investigation has been initiated. If you wish to address this matter or make any statement, please contact our office." Natalie's blood ran cold. She stood frozen, torn between her newfound sense of strength and the familiar terror that Jackson might come storming in, trying to claim her, or worse, take her baby. When Marlene heard the news, she calmly reassured Natalie that they'd face this together. Her unwavering support gave Natalie the courage to take action. She would file for legal separation on the grounds of abandonment. And if it came to it, she'd fight for full custody in court. Helen, her boss, promised to represent her pro bono if the situation escalated. The days that followed were riddled with anxiety. Natalie found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see Jackson lurking in the shadows. But no confrontation ever came, just the occasional letter from the investigator, which she firmly refused to respond to. Her priority was clear: protect herself and her unborn child. She truly believed Jackson was unfit to be a father. What she didn't know was that her absence had already set off a chain reaction, one that would soon lead to an unexpected and dramatic showdown. Back in Cincinnati, Jackson Pierce fought to keep his empire afloat as scandal closed in on all sides. A major investor accused his firm of concealing environmental hazards on one of its development sites. Legal battles mounted, and Jackson's once limitless confidence began to falter. To his dismay, the media's attention shifted beyond his business dealings to his personal life. Speculative headlines asked, "Where is the missing Mrs. Pierce?" At first, Jackson tried to control the narrative. He painted Natalie as an emotionally unstable spouse who simply needed space. But the tabloids weren't satisfied with such vague explanations. Rumors swirled: an affair, financial deceit, even foul play. The more Jackson tried to shut it down, the more the story exploded. Shareholders demanded answers. Business partners grew uneasy, questioning his ability to lead the company through such a public and personal storm. One late night, Jackson found himself alone in his penthouse office. The lights of the city below sparkled, but they felt like they were mocking him. He'd always prided himself on his iron will, his refusal to crack under pressure. But now, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. A memory surfaced: Natalie's tear-streaked face the night she told him she was pregnant. The hope she'd carried in that moment. A pang of something, guilt, regret, twisted in his gut. But he shoved it aside. Weakness had no place in his world. Still, the doubt gnawed at him. Business partners began pulling out of deals. Whispers circled that Jackson's life was spiraling out of control. It dawned on Jackson that publicly reuniting with his wife, even if just for show, might help quiet the gossip. He reasoned that if Natalie returned, or if he could stage some form of reconciliation, the media's attention would shift away from the cracks in his business empire. That's when he hired the private investigator to find her. But weeks passed with few results. The investigator uncovered only fragments: a motel Natalie had stayed in, a canceled phone line, and scattered sightings in small towns near the state border. Jackson's frustration grew. How could Natalie, someone who had never lived outside his shadow, now vanish so effectively? Anger curdled into something darker. He became determined to reassert control at any cost. Months later, on a chilly morning, Natalie woke to sharp, jabbing pains. Her contractions had started. Marlene rushed her to the nearest hospital, a small but well-equipped facility, recently expanded through philanthropic funding from the Mercy Healthcare Foundation. In the delivery room, Natalie clutched Marlene's hand with white-knuckled intensity. Tears streamed down her face as waves of pain and anticipation overtook her body. Hours later, Natalie gave birth to a baby girl. The newborn's first cry pierced the silence, cutting through Natalie's exhaustion. For a moment, the rest of the world faded away. Marlene, her eyes shimmering with tears, whispered, "She's beautiful, dear." Natalie named her daughter Amara, a name that echoed her own and symbolized courage. When the nurse brought Amara into her arms, Natalie gently touched her tiny fingers. In that instant, she felt an overwhelming surge of protective love, raw and all-consuming. No matter what happened from here on, Natalie vowed that her daughter would grow up in a space filled with warmth and safety, far away from the cold, manipulative life she had escaped. News of the birth reached Jackson through the same private investigator who had finally tracked Natalie's name in the county records. She had deliberately left Jackson's name off the birth certificate, writing, "Father unknown." She wanted no legal connection to him, no chance for him to disrupt Amara's future. When Jackson read the official notice about baby girl Pierce, a strange sensation tightened his chest. His child had been born, and he hadn't even known. And Natalie had denied his paternity. This time, the regret struck deeper. But it was quickly followed by resentment and wounded pride. He instructed his legal team to prepare a paternity suit, determined to force official recognition. To Jackson, it wasn't just about fatherhood. It was a tactical move to restore his image. Though to outsiders, it reeked of a power grab. Less than 2 weeks after returning from the hospital, Natalie, still sore, her baby barely learning to nurse, received a summons. The court demanded she submit Amara for a DNA test or face legal consequences. Fear coursed through her, but so did defiance. She had come too far, rebuilt too much, to let Jackson's arrogance unravel the fragile life she was creating. With Marlene's unwavering support and Helen's legal guidance, Natalie resolved to fight. The day of the hearing arrived. In a modest courthouse tucked within their small town, Natalie stood before the judge, her emotions swirling. Nervousness, indignation, and a fierce protectiveness for Amara. Jackson sat across the aisle, flanked by a team of sharp-suited, high-powered attorneys. His cold gaze flicked briefly toward Natalie before settling on the judge. Jackson's lawyers argued that he had every right to claim paternity and involvement in the child's life. They painted Natalie as a runaway wife, someone who had refused to communicate and unlawfully kept him in the dark about his own child. Natalie's attorney, Helen, countered with compelling evidence: Jackson's abandonment, his complete lack of support during the pregnancy, and his blatant neglect in the face of a life-threatening situation. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The judge listened intently, occasionally tapping a pen against the bench. When the time came for testimonies, Natalie spoke clearly and vividly, recounting how Jackson had pushed her away, how he had left her to fend for herself during a violent blizzard. She described her fear, her isolation, and the near-fatal rescue by Marlene. The older woman also testified, her voice faltering at times as she remembered finding Natalie nearly frozen in the snow. Jackson, in turn, gave a rigid denial. He claimed he had no idea the storm would be that severe, and that Natalie had overreacted, that she had chosen to leave. But his defense quickly unraveled under cross-examination. His callous remarks and prolonged indifference were laid bare as Helen read aloud old texts and emails that exposed his blatant disregard for Natalie's well-being. In the end, the judge ordered a DNA test to establish paternity. But she also issued a stern rebuke to Jackson for his negligence. The court made it clear, if the test confirmed he was the father, custody and support arrangements would be decided accordingly. A separate custody hearing would follow once the DNA results were finalized. Natalie exited the courtroom with her head held high. Outside, reporters swarmed. Jackson, cornered by flashing cameras, offered a stiff smile and told the press he looked forward to being a responsible father. But Natalie could see the fury simmering behind his carefully controlled expression. This battle was far from over. Back in Cincinnati, Jackson faced a relentless cascade of professional collapse. The Langford Group had officially pulled out of their deal, causing a domino effect of investor withdrawals and panic. Stock prices for his publicly traded ventures plummeted. Creditors began calling in loans. Rumors spread rapidly. Jackson Pierce's once proud real estate empire was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. He spent long nights with financial advisors, trying desperately to restructure debts and salvage what little he could. At the same time, he endured the public humiliation of being portrayed in the media as a heartless husband and absent father. Every step outside his penthouse was met with a barrage of camera flashes and pointed questions about Natalie and baby Amara. Under normal circumstances, Jackson might have withstood the pressure. But this time, the personal and professional disasters collided, creating a perfect storm that left him feeling cornered and desperate. He fired several longtime staff members, convinced they were disloyal. A handful of top executives jumped ship to rival firms. His lawyers advised him to settle the paternity case quickly. Dragging it out would only amplify the negative press. As the walls closed in, Jackson began to reconsider the choices that had led him to this point. Late at night, alone in a penthouse that now felt hollow and lifeless, he stared out over the city lights, consumed by a growing tide of regret. He remembered how Natalie used to look at him with admiration, how her laughter had once brought warmth to the empty corners of his world. He could still hear the softness in her voice when she told him she was pregnant, her eyes filled with cautious hope. Could he have done things differently? Could he have treated her with the love and respect she truly deserved? Yes. There had been many such moments, and Jackson had wasted every single one. Back in the quiet town, Natalie cradled Amara close, her baby's tiny body radiating warmth against her chest. The nights were long, sleep coming in short stretches, but every time Amara opened her curious eyes or smiled softly in her sleep, Natalie felt a wave of joy unlike anything she'd ever known. She worked part-time for Helen, mostly from home so she could care for Amara. Marlene remained her rock, offering calm, wise advice from a lifetime of hard-earned experience. Then came the envelope. The final custody hearing had been scheduled. The DNA test had confirmed what Natalie already knew. Jackson was Amara's biological father. Now the court would determine parental rights. Natalie's heart pounded with fear. She worried Jackson's wealth, influence, and connections would drown out her voice. She'd heard too many horror stories, stories where powerful men used the legal system to bend outcomes in their favor. Still, she refused to be intimidated. She and Helen gathered medical records, statements from therapists who documented Jackson's emotional neglect, and testimonies from neighbors who had seen firsthand how devoted and capable Natalie was as a mother. Each night, after putting Amara to sleep, Natalie pored over legal documents, steeling herself for the battle ahead. One evening, sensing her fatigue, Marlene gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "You're fighting not just for yourself anymore," she said softly. "You're fighting for Amara, and remember, you don't have to do it alone." Those words reignited Natalie's fire. She was no longer the passive wife who tolerated emotional manipulation. She had grown strong, and that strength burned brighter than any fear. The day of the custody hearing dawned cold and gray, as if the sky itself mirrored Natalie's unease. She dressed in a modest, neatly pressed suit, her hair pulled back with quiet determination. Marlene waited outside the courtroom with Amara, ready to care for the baby while the proceedings unfolded. Jackson arrived in a tailored suit, appearing as composed as ever. But beneath the surface, there was a visible tension in his posture. His legal team was smaller this time, likely a sign of the financial pressure bearing down on him. Natalie and Jackson exchanged brief nods, an unspoken signal that their lives were about to change forever. And then, the testimonies began. Medical professionals confirmed that Natalie had nearly died in the snowstorm while pregnant. Marlene gave a moving account of discovering her half frozen in the snow, highlighting Jackson's complete absence and lack of concern. Helen presented meticulously organized evidence showing that Jackson had been fully aware of Natalie's fragile condition, yet had made no attempt to help or even contact her for months. Jackson's attorney attempted to shift the narrative, arguing that Jackson had believed Natalie left for personal reasons and that he had been heartbroken by her refusal to communicate. But under Helen's unrelenting cross-examination, Jackson faltered. He couldn't convincingly explain why he had never tried to reconcile after learning of her near-death experience. His claims of wanting to be a father rang hollow, drowned out by the damning facts of his neglect and the suspicious timing, which aligned more with his business collapse than any genuine paternal desire. The judge listened closely, occasionally casting a sharp glance toward Jackson with a raised eyebrow. It was clear. Much of his testimony lacked true remorse. After a final recess, the judge delivered her decision. Natalie would be granted sole legal custody of Amara. Jackson would be permitted to petition for supervised visitation only after completing a court-approved parenting course and demonstrating consistent effort in being a part of Amara's life. In addition, Jackson was ordered to pay child support, an amount to be determined through a financial review. However, given the shaky state of his business affairs, that figure was likely to be minimal. In that moment, Natalie felt an overwhelming wave of relief and an unexpected pang of sorrow. She had once loved Jackson deeply. It was heartbreaking to realize how far things had fallen, but her focus now was Amara. She stood tall as the judge finalized the ruling. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for a quote. Natalie clutched Amara tightly, shielding her from the chaos. Helen blocked the barrage of cameras with practiced ease. Jackson, caught in the center of the crowd, forced a tight-lipped smile. "I love my daughter," he muttered to a microphone shoved in his face. But his eyes told a different story, one filled with bitterness, defeat, and maybe a trace of regret that no longer mattered. In the months that followed, Jackson's business crumbled further. More lawsuits came from angry investors, culminating in a forced sale of most of the company's assets. Though Jackson retained some personal wealth, the days of lavish penthouse living and champagne-soaked parties were over. His name, once a symbol of dominance and success, had become a cautionary tale in corporate circles. He eventually attempted to see Amara under the court's supervised visitation order. The sessions took place at a local facility, designed for monitored parental visits, with social workers present at all times. Natalie, through Helen, had arranged for limited, structured contact. The first time Jackson held Amara, something stirred within him. She was tiny, so small, and had Natalie's eyes. Those same wide, curious eyes now stared up at this stranger, claiming to be her father. Jackson managed a faint smile. But Amara began to fuss, unaccustomed to the man holding her, with the man who had only now decided to appear in her daughter's life. The social worker quietly noted Jackson's discomfort, the subtle tremble in his hands as he tried awkwardly to soothe Amara. Maybe it was guilt for everything he'd done, or maybe he was beginning to understand that fatherhood was more than just a title for press releases or a line on a court document. Whatever the cause, Jackson left the session visibly shaken. Natalie noticed. She saw the same man who had once loomed over her with cold, unshakable arrogance, now reduced to someone uncertain and hollow. Part of her felt justified. This was karma, the natural consequence of the cruelty he had so casually inflicted. Yet, another part of her remembered a time when Jackson had been different. The early days, when there had been traces of tenderness. She wondered if that version of him had disappeared forever, devoured by ambition and pride. In the weeks that followed, Jackson missed 2 of his scheduled visitations. Each time he offered flimsy excuses, an urgent meeting, a financial emergency. The social worker issued a firm warning. Continued absences would jeopardize his right to see Amara. Natalie, for her part, remained resolute. She neither encouraged nor blocked Jackson's access. She allowed him the chance to show up, to do the right thing, but she wouldn't lift a finger to help a man who had nearly let her and their child die. Then, on a crisp autumn evening, Jackson appeared, unexpectedly, at Marlene's front door, a battered suitcase in hand. Natalie froze, startled to see him at the one place that had become her safe haven. She stiffened immediately. "How did you find this address?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. Jackson looked as if he had aged 10 years. His shoulders slumped, dark circles under his eyes. "The private investigator," he admitted. "I paid him one last time, told him I needed to apologize." Natalie instinctively stepped back, her heart thundering in her chest. Marlene, sensing the rising tension, lingered just out of view, ready to intervene. I lost nearly everything," Jackson said, his voice raw. "The business is gone. I'm losing the penthouse. I don't have anywhere else to go." Natalie's anger flared. "And you think showing up here is going to fix that? We are not your safety net." Jackson shook his head. His eyes shimmered. "I know. I'm not asking for money. I'm not even asking to stay. I just wanted to see Amara, and to say I'm sorry." The air grew thick with unspoken memories. Natalie studied his face, searching for truth. Was this real remorse? Or just another manipulation? Jackson's voice cracked. "I was a fool. I let everything slip through my fingers, my family, my integrity. I don't blame you if you can't forgive me, but I needed to say it." Marlene gently placed a hand on Natalie's shoulder. Natalie's emotions surged: fury, grief, pity, and reluctantly, the faintest glimmer of compassion. Slowly, she stepped aside. "I'll give you 5 minutes," she said quietly. She said stiffly, "But this doesn't change anything about custody or visitation. You have to earn the right to be in Amara's life." Jackson swallowed hard and nodded. He followed Natalie into the living room, where Amara was napping quietly in a bassinet. Gently, he knelt beside the baby. Tears slipped down his cheeks. Seeing him so vulnerable, so genuinely broken, stirred a mix of emotions in Natalie. She remembered the nights she cried alone, the days she almost died, and the emptiness of their marriage. But there was also a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Jackson could change, even after leaving so much damage in his wake. In a shaky whisper, Jackson asked, "May I hold her?" Natalie looked at him for a long, heavy moment. Then carefully she lifted her daughter and placed her into his arms. For several minutes, he held the sleeping infant, tears falling silently onto her tiny blanket. Whatever happened next, Natalie knew one thing for sure. She would never allow Jackson to hurt her again. She had the power now, the power to protect her child, to define the terms of their lives. And as she watched Jackson cradle Amara, she saw clearly. He was paying the price for his cruelty and neglect. He had lost nearly everything. And the last thread of redemption rested in whether he could truly become a better man. In the months that followed, Jackson committed to his supervised visitation sessions. Under the watchful eyes of social workers, he learned how to change diapers, how to bottle feed Amara, and how to comfort her when she cried. He made mistakes. Amara remained unsure of him. But every small win, like getting her to giggle once, seemed to fill Jackson with quiet wonder. Meanwhile, Natalie continued living with Marlene, saving money steadily until she could afford her own apartment. She thrived in her job, earning praise and even a modest promotion for her hard work. Helen applauded Natalie's resilience and even hinted she might soon take on more responsibilities, or eventually pursue her dream of going to law school. Life wasn't perfect, but it was stable. And that meant everything to Natalie. In those dark days when she had nearly frozen in the snow, she never imagined this kind of peace was possible. She found purpose in motherhood, forging an unbreakable bond with Amara, one no storm or man could sever. As for Jackson, he accepted a modest consulting position with a small firm. The designer suits and private jets were gone, replaced by public transportation and a sparsely furnished apartment. His fall from grace had been widely discussed, but in time, the media's focus drifted to fresher scandals. Through court-mandated therapy and his own growing self-awareness, Jackson began to confront the man he had been and the boy he once was, desperate to prove himself. He confessed to his therapist that he regretted not cherishing Natalie when he had the chance, admitting that his obsession with money and success had blinded him to the blessings he already had. Then, one bitterly cold December evening, nearly a year after Amara's birth, Natalie was cleaning the kitchen while Amara slept peacefully in the nursery. Marlene had gone to visit family, and then came a knock at the door. The knock startled Natalie. She opened the door to find Jackson standing on the stoop, snowflakes clinging to his coat. Concern flickered across her face. It was late. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low so as not to wake Amara. Jackson avoided her eyes. He looked anxious. "I wanted to give you something. A letter." She folded her arms, wary. She had received many letters from him in the past, some laced with legal jargon, others filled with hollow apologies. "Another letter?" He nodded and handed her a plain white envelope. She hesitated, then slowly opened it, scanning the handwritten lines. It wasn't like the others. This was a full admission of guilt. A raw, honest apology. Jackson detailed every regret he carried, from dismissing her pregnancy to abandoning her in the blizzard. He promised to respect her choices and to support Amara's future in whatever way she deemed appropriate. If that meant staying at a distance or being involved only on her terms, he would abide. He wrote that he knew forgiveness might never come, but that he hoped one day Amara might be proud to call him her father. Natalie's throat tightened. These were the words she had longed to hear back when she was pregnant, clinging to hope for a shred of his humanity. The letter ended simply, "I know my karma has come full circle. I've lost what matters most, and I have no one to blame but myself." She folded the letter, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Jackson exhaled, as if releasing a breath he had held for far too long. He looked like a man ready to face the rest of his life, no matter how difficult. "I'll leave you to it," he said softly, turning to go. Impulsively, Natalie reached out. "Wait, do you want to come in for a minute?" Surprise flickered in his eyes. He nodded timidly and stepped inside. They sat in the living room, an echo of the night he'd once arrived with a suitcase. But this time, the air was different. There was no anger, no desperation, only a cautious acknowledgement that life had changed them both. Natalie offered him tea. He accepted it, but didn't drink. Instead, he quietly observed the home, the cozy touches, the framed photos of Amara, the handmade quilts Marlene had sewn. His eyes settled on Natalie, who now looked more grounded, more at peace than he had ever seen her. After a moment, Natalie broke the silence. "I don't hate you," she said. "I did for a while. But hate is heavy. I have Amara to think about, and I won't poison her world with bitterness." Jackson's expression twisted with emotion. "I never deserved you," he said quietly. She shook her head. "It's not about deserving, it's about learning. We can't erase what's happened, but maybe, for Amara's sake, we can figure out a way forward." That night, they talked, not about the past, but about what came next. Visitation schedules, financial responsibilities, the possibility of co-parenting classes. For the first time, Jackson listened earnestly. The conversation didn't heal every wound or erase every trace of resentment, but it laid the first fragile stones of a new foundation, one where Amara's well-being would always come first. In the still hours before dawn, Jackson quietly left, gently closing the door behind him. Natalie stood motionless for a long while, absorbing the weight of what had just transpired. She looked again at the letter, those handwritten words of true remorse. Karma had indeed found its way to Jackson. His empire lay in ruins, his reputation in shambles. Yet perhaps, just perhaps, this moment marked the beginning of something better. If he truly meant to change. Outside, the snow shimmered beneath the pale moonlight, a quiet reminder of how far Natalie had come since that night the storm nearly took her life. She drew in a deep breath, a soft sense of closure washing over her. Life would never return to what it once was. But it was hers now, a life she had fought for, endured for, and rebuilt with love at its very core. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey of betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimately, hope. Natalie's story reminds us that even in the darkest hour, when everything feels lost and the storm threatens to bury us, there is still a path forward, paved with resilience, honesty, and love. Jackson learned the hard truth. Material success could never substitute for real compassion and responsibility. And in the end, it was Natalie's unwavering strength and a single, sincere act of human kindness that lit the way forward for them both. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who might need its message, and subscribing for more stories that celebrate redemption, growth, and the resilience of the human spirit. Your support means the world. I look forward to sharing more with you soon. Dear friend, life will always test us in ways we least expect. As the Stoics remind us, we cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them. Natalie didn't get to choose the betrayal, the storm, or the silence that followed, but she chose to rise, to protect, to forgive, and to rebuild. Her journey shows us that healing doesn't come from the world handing us justice. It comes from the quiet strength we summon within ourselves when the world doesn't. So if you're standing in your own storm, may you remember, the power to begin again has always been yours. Choose peace, choose purpose, choose to begin again. If this story spoke to you, go ahead and give it a like. Share it with someone who might need a little light today. And don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this one. Thank you for being here.